Kings and kingdoms will bow down, and every chain will break as broken hearts declare His praise. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before Him. So open up the gate, make way before the King of Kings. The God who comes to save is here to set the captives free. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before Him. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? 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 Who can stop the Lord? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles. Every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains. Every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before Him.
Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm David Robinson, and if you have a Bible in one form or fashion, I'd love for you to get to the tiny little book called Titus. Titus is a tremendous New Testament book. It's written by the Apostle Paul, and I'd like to start by reading the first few verses 1 through 5. Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ for the faith of God's elect and the knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness, a faith and knowledge resting on the hope of eternal life, which God, who does not lie, promised before the beginning of time. And at His appointed season, He brought His word to light through the preaching entrusted to me by the command of God our Savior to Titus, my true son in our common faith. Grace and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Savior. The reason I left you at Crete was that you might straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. All right, so this is the very beginning of Paul's letter to Titus. Now, have you ever heard of something called an influencer? It's somebody who has the power to affect other people's decisions because of their position or their knowledge about something or their authority. And there are all kinds of areas of our lives in which people can have great influence. In fact, over the last decade or so, social media influencers have sprung up all over the place and can make a post about a particular slice of life or a product people use, and it affects people's behavior around that. Think of economic influencers, and one comment or statement or post or tweet from somebody who's an economic influencer, it can turn the NASDAQ or the Dow Jones or the S&P 500 all, one way or the other in a single day. There are fashion folks who have a huge influence over style. One day they say leisure suits are out and spandex is in. And then they say spandex is out and baggy clothes are in. And then baggy clothes are out and skinny jeans are in. And we all just kind of march in lockstep because of their influence. Time magazine, every year they have an issue dedicated to identifying the 100 most influential people in all kinds of areas: business, sports, entertainment, media, fashion, you name it. But the book of Titus reminds us that there's also spiritual influence. It's the ability to impact another human being's character, about the ability to affect another person's soul, about the ability to influence the extent of their intimacy with God. Spiritual influence. If you were to create your own list of the most spiritually influential people in your life, who would they be? And would you be on somebody's list? Now, in our society, influence, just general influence, is usually based on quite temporary values. It's usually positional influence. It's based on somebody's title or on their attractiveness or their status, that kind of thing. And when they lose their position or their money or their looks, when their term of office is over, well, their influence can sometimes evaporate. But spiritual influence is another kind of source. Spiritual influence, as the name indicates, is the work of the Holy Spirit, the very Spirit of God. Spiritual influence happens when one human being becomes so sincerely devoted to following Jesus above everything else that some of Jesus Christ's actual life and power and love and presence begin to change that person. And other people, they see that life, the life of Jesus essentially, in a real human being, and they realize that they want that life too more than anything else. And they begin to change. And many of you have experienced that. And so have I. Spiritual influence is very often utterly unrelated to titles or positions or status or achievement. And spiritual influence is, in fact, the primary way that Christian community, we together as CCC get formed, as we model for each other and teach each other and pray for each other and encourage and rebuke each other as God's Spirit guides us to do that. And as we do that, we'll leave our fingerprints all over what matters most to God, which is His church. You can be a person of enormous spiritual influence in your home, in your small group, in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in your school. And in this first chapter of this tiny book of Titus, we see the crucial role of spiritual influence in the church. We see, first of all, Paul's influence on Titus. Paul begins with the introduction of how his life has been marked by the faith and knowledge that he came from God. And then he says to Titus in verse 4, "My true son in our common faith." And that's not a throwaway phrase. There's incredible significance in that phrase. My true son, Titus. What would be especially striking to anybody in the first century is the fact that Paul was a Jew, but Titus was a Gentile. And this meant historically they were sworn enemies. Devout Jewish rabbis used to pray a prayer every day thanking God that God didn't create them a Gentile. A devout Jewish rabbi wouldn't touch a Gentile, wouldn't speak to a Gentile, wouldn't eat with a Gentile, and considered any contact with a Gentile something that would make them unclean. And we got to understand this. These are two very different guys here, different backgrounds, different beliefs, different religious beliefs, different political beliefs. They're different guys, but the fundamental depth they shared in Jesus Christ, it bound them together and united them. And the love of Jesus so transformed them, so influenced Paul's heart in particular, that he reached out to a Gentile. And Titus, he was converted and he was changed spiritually, largely through Paul's spiritual influence. Paul would take Titus with him on journeys. He'd travel with him and eat with him and teach him and mentor him and pray for him. And Paul's fingerprints ended up all over Titus. And there were a lot of times that wasn't an easy thing for that to happen at all. I mean, Titus is mentioned a number of times in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the early section of the book of Galatians. Paul says that many years earlier, he had been with Titus in Jerusalem, and a group of legalistic Jewish Christians, they found out that Titus was a Gentile, but he was traveling with Paul. He's in fellowship with Paul, and Titus hadn't been circumcised. And these legalistic Jewish Christians, well, they were furious about that fact that Titus hadn't been circumcised. So they say to Paul, hey, Paul, Titus has got to be circumcised. And Paul says, no, he doesn't. And they say, yes, he does. Titus has got to be circumcised right now. And I'm sure Titus is thinking, I would like to have a say in this, you know? It was a tremendous conflict. And Paul, at great personal risk, he refuses to cave into some very powerful people. And above all, what he's guarding for Titus is Titus's spiritual freedom. He says, I'm going to refuse to let Titus be crushed by legalism and a mechanical, almost oppressive approach to God. I'm not going to let that happen. Paul, he saw tremendous potential in Titus. In fact, if you've ever read in the Bible Paul's letters to Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you know that the church at Corinth had some real serious problems. And Paul in 2 Corinthians 7, he refers to a letter that he had written. It's sometimes called the severe letter because Paul talks about how it caused great sorrow among the Corinthians. Well, guess who had to deliver that letter? Well, it was Titus. Titus was Paul's emissary who delivered that letter. To a large extent, when Paul wrote that letter, along with that letter, he put the fate of the church of Corinth in Titus's hands. And so Titus, he was able to resolve some very difficult problems there in Corinth, which could have destroyed that church there. So Paul's fingerprints are all over Titus, his true son. And then Titus's fingerprints are all over the church at Corinth. And now we open up this letter here in verse 5, and we find out that Paul is very concerned about the church in Crete. And Crete, it's an island in the south of Greece, and it was made up of many, many towns. And so there were actually many, many churches on this one island that Paul's concerned about. And he says in verse 5 there, he says, Titus, the reason I left you in Crete was so that you might straighten out what was left unfinished, and you'd appoint elders in every town. There were many towns, many churches. That's how he directed him. It's rare when we get the chance to focus on what the Bible says regarding elders. And there are really two classic sections in the New Testament of the Bible that have to do with elders. One of them is right here in Titus. And then there's a real similar set of verses in 1 Timothy 3. And I want us to think about this today, to learn some of what the Bible has to say about elders, these very specific leaders in a church who are to be people of great spiritual influence. In our church here at CCC, there are basically three sort of circles of leadership. It's helpful to think about three circles that kind of overlap with each other. And each has a distinct place and role, and each is crucial. One is the staff team. The folks that the church has hired to carry out and execute the mission of CCC. We have about 15 folks who are employed here at CCC, both part-time and full-time. And most often, they work in close conjunction with anyone who volunteers in one way or shape or form. So the volunteer team, think about people on our frontline team, folks who hand out programs and reset supplies on the weekend and help in the parking lot. They scoop up all the goose poop from the parking lot before anybody gets here. Oh my goodness. You talk about a huge job. That's a huge job. They clean up after services, after everybody leaves, and they empty trash and on and on and on. But, music and tech folks, children's ministry, small group leaders, and student ministry volunteers, and pantry organizers, and all this and more. It's the volunteer team. In fact, the last event we had here at CCC before COVID-19 showed up and kind of halted in-person gatherings for a while was a volunteer extravaganza dinner right here in this room right here, in this auditorium here at CCC. And it was just a way of saying, hey, thanks for what you're doing. It's so very important. It's very crucial, that influence you're having on moving the mission of CCC forward. It was a fun night. That's the volunteer team there. So the staff team, the volunteer team, and then the elder team. which is a group of people who lead at a sort of 30,000 foot level, making sure the church is headed in the right direction, keeping the church accountable, overseeing and caring for and praying for CCC. And the elder team is just as critical to the church as the staff team and the volunteer team. In fact, take a look at what's happening in Crete, back to Titus here, because there are no elders. Look at verse 10. The situation in Crete in churches where there were no elders, for there are many rebellious people, mere talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision group. They must be silenced because they're ruining whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain. And then if you fast forward a little bit into the third chapter of Titus, Titus 3:10, we get another little picture of what's going on in these churches in Crete. Paul says to Titus, warn divisive people once, and then warn them a second time. And after that, have nothing to do with them. I mean, it's barely a 3 strikes and you're out kind of deal here. This is very strong and serious language. Paul doesn't use this kind of language casually. The church in Crete is in real serious trouble. They face division. They face false teaching. They face bad thinking, bad theology. They face unconfronted sin. And the large part of why that is, and a large measure of the remedy, is that the churches lack the spiritual influence of effective elders. They lack spiritual influencers. And let me say a word about this, because this can happen to any church. I know for many of you who are part of CCC, this is the only church you've ever been a part of. And I've been a part of a few churches now in my life, but I've seen the inner workings of dozens and dozens and dozens of churches. And let me tell you, it is just terrible what can happen when a church does not have effective spiritual oversight in place, or when the wrong people are in leadership and serve as elders. Elders are kind of like guards for a community. Some of you may remember learning about Lewis and Clark, the Lewis and Clark expedition. They had to face a lot of misbehavior in the soldiers that were with them. A lot of fighting and drinking and theft and desertion and that sort of thing. But do you know the behavior that received the worst punishment? It was when somebody fell asleep during guard duty. Now that sounds like it was kind of an accidental thing, but it was punishable by death. And there's good reason for that, because that's the one act that would place the entire community at risk. To be a guard was a sacred trust. Well, the same thing is true when it comes to a church. When there's a lack of appropriate elder influence, churches can drift off mission. Conflict gets mishandled. And it was here in Crete. And unresolved conflict just gets tolerated. And this really happens more often than you could ever imagine. Factions can form, and people for whom Jesus died to make brothers and sisters out of them, they quit speaking to each other. They believe the worst about each other. They say slanderous things about one another. Over time, the whole church, God's dream for this earth, God's plan A, His bride, His body, it gets poisoned by a spirit of bitterness. Sometimes, without the influence of a team of elders, a church's commitment to theological truth can get fuzzy, and whole churches can drift into theological error and foolishness. Without encouragement and empowering from elders, leaders can get discouraged or grow isolated or get burned out. Most of you will never know in the life of the leadership of this church of the kind of encouraging and empowering that's come down through the years from folks who have served as leaders and elders here at CCC. And without mature elders overseeing it all, a church is just headed for disaster, because then there's a breakdown in accountability. There's no appropriate accountability. And the church can get real vulnerable to things like financial mismanagement and abuses of power and a loss of trust. A church's spiritual integrity, it ends up getting compromised. And anytime those kinds of things happen in any church, well, the evil one rejoices because it's damaging what God cares about most, which is His church. And our adversary, the evil one, would love for it to happen here at this church, given the ministry that God's given CCC. You think for a moment about the spiritual battle that must be going on around here. We've been operating now for 15 years, and we've had our fair share of problems and challenges, many of them on display this past year. But we have not lived for one day in the shadow of these kinds of integrity-busting, heart-rending, God-dishonoring tragedies that have the power to completely destroy and derail a local church. We haven't had that for a day. And humanly speaking, as much as anything, it's because of a group of leaders, elders, who most of you will never know, never hear, rarely, if ever, see, who sacrifice time, effort, energy, resources, prayer to guard what matters most to God, His church. You know, a guy named Heath Schnelly, he has been a good friend to me for some years now, and he's been somewhat of a mentor for me, a coach for me in church and pastoral leadership. He's a real brilliant guy, sharp guy, and he loves the church, and he understands the church. And he was there at the very beginning of CCC, sort of the gestation period before we even launched. And I remember he said to me, David, he said, the most important decision that will affect the first 25 to 30 years of this church are whoever it is that's appointed to become the first elder team. And I think he was right. So listen, CCC, don't ever take the gift of a well-functioning elder team for granted. You pray for them and honor them and value their contributions. And every once in a while, if you know one and you see one, just tell them thanks. Because there's one thing about fingerprints. Often, fingerprints, they're not visible to the naked eye. You got to dust for them. And then when you dust for them, they're visible. And I think one day God's going to dust this church. And when He does, the fingerprints of a little group of elders are going to be all over this place. And I'm so grateful God has given us the elders that we have. Now, Paul here to Titus in the first chapter of this little letter, Paul talks about what kind of person ought to be selected to become an elder. And I want us to look at this for just a moment. And you might be asking, why is it important for us to look at the criteria for becoming an elder? And that's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. Well, because it's important for all of us to be clear on what the criteria is that's laid out in the Bible. We need to be familiar with that. And don't miss this criteria, it's something all of us should aspire to. See, God's goal is not that His church should have a few mature leaders, elders, guards, and then a bunch of real immature folks. His goal is that all of us should have the kind of maturity and character that would be characteristic of an elder. Not that we're all serving that role. That's not what's needed. I mean, there are lots and lots of other roles and gifts and all that. But God's goal for a church is that it grows up and that the level of maturity and character, it's representative of the church overall, so that we can all function in roles of spiritual influence with one another. That's God's goal. God's hope is to have a church full of mature, highly responsible, discerning men and women of God. So here's what I'd like to do for our final few minutes with this. I'd like for you, wherever you're watching this, to pull out a pen and piece of paper, or maybe your phone if it wouldn't distract you. Grab something where you could do a little self-assessment. Last weekend I asked you to do a self-assessment of the words that you communicate, your speech, your tongue. And that was a good exercise for us. This week we'll do a quick maturity test, maybe an elder readiness check or something like that, and look at the qualities that Paul mentions here. And you just rate yourself. Maybe thinking about this past year, for instance, real honestly now, in each of the categories we'll talk through here, rate yourself on where you are. And here can be our scale, all right? If you find yourself growing more and more like Jesus, maturing in the way He wants you to go, give yourself a 1 in that category. If you're kind of neutral, same place you were essentially last year, give yourself a 2. And if you're kind of sliding backwards on it, you headed the wrong direction, give yourself a 3, all right? Real simple. 1, 2, or 3, little diagnostic checkup today. Here are the marks of spiritual influence and the things that make somebody a potential elder. Starting with verse 6 now, he says, an elder must be blameless. You may want to write that word down on your paper, blameless. Now, let's pause here for a moment. How many of you are out of the running already? Let's think about this word blameless here, okay? The idea here is not that you've never blown it, you never sinned, although if it was, the elder team would be a team of 0. what Paul's saying is that elders need to have a public reputation that's not marked by scandal or by a lack of integrity. Again, in some churches, elders are chosen on real bad ground. Sometimes it's just whoever's real powerful or popular or something along those lines. And that gets churches in a whole lot of trouble. It actually takes a lot of maturity on the part of a congregation to have appropriate elders. And Paul is saying, hey, no matter what a person's other gifts are, what their power or qualifications are, a church can't put a person in a position of influence where that person has undealt with character flaws that could make a mockery of the church's mission. So that's his first word on the subject there. Rate yourself, all right? 1, 2, or 3. 1, doing pretty well, moving in the right direction. 2, about the same. 3, moving backwards. And then he goes on. And he talks about family life there in verse 6. If you're married, what's your marriage dynamic? And if you have kids, what's your family dynamic? And he essentially holds up authenticity. That'd be a good word to write down. Authenticity. It's the most important thing here because the people who know me best are the people who see me in my most unguarded moments. That's the people I live with. Not only am I a pastor, a minister, a preacher, but I'm the son of a preacher. In the words of Aretha Franklin, I'm the sweet-talking son of a preacher man. Anyway, a lot of times, preachers' kids get wounded by their experience through the church. Sometimes that can happen. They can become bitter or resentful or angry or any number of things. And that happens a lot. And one of the reasons I believe that happens is because who their mom and dad are, who their parents are on a Sunday morning in front of everybody, it's not who they are the rest of the week. And part of why the beauty of the church has just always captured me more than the underbelly of the church is because my parents, my mom and dad, they were the real deal. Who they were on Sunday when the church gathered and the mic was on, that was the same people they were Monday through Saturday. They were authentic. They were the real deal. And I'm so glad they were. And Paul says, listen, when you're looking for an elder, when you're talking about maturity here, anybody who's maturing, look at the spiritual fingerprints they're leaving at home. Because spiritual influence requires home-tested authenticity. So a question for all of us. What kind of fingerprints are you leaving on those you live with? Or how about this? What's one doable step that you could help leave positive spiritual fingerprints on the people you're closest to? Because spiritual influence requires home-tested authenticity. Rate yourself there. 1, 2, 3, more Christ-like, about the same, moving in the wrong direction. All right. Paul goes on in verse 7 to talk about another category here, which is self-control. And Paul gives 3 things that fit into this self-control area. He says, make sure they're not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness. Now let's think about this. Not overbearing. And this has to do with pride here. All right, a couple of questions. Do you find yourself getting more judgmental toward other people these days or more accepting? Are you more able to rejoice when somebody else gets the spotlight? Or do you find yourself suddenly trying to make sure other people know how impressive, you are and the things that you do are? Where are you at with this relative to pride? More Christ-like, kind of neutral, some backwards movement? Then must not be quick-tempered, he says. How often do you let it fly, Do you use words to hurt people these days? Are you growing in your ability to show patience and gentleness? Again, rate yourself, 1, 2, or 3. Then he says, not given to drunkenness. Now, that was a common problem in Paul's day, and let's not pretend that it's not in ours. But you can include in this, any addictive patterns or problems of habit. Do they have a stronger or weaker grip on you? What are your patterns? Now, the next thing he talks about here has to do with power and the misuse of power. You could write power down here. Paul says, not violent. And he's not just talking about physical violence, but the use of force or intimidation to get your way. If you get people with power issues serving as leaders and elders, that's a serious, serious problem. But how about you? I know when it comes to power, when we bring up the word power, we think about CEOs or politicians or some sort of positional power like that. And some of us are tempted to let ourselves off the hook here. But listen, All of us have some positional authority and power at different times in our lives. I mean, even if you're 12 years old, you have some positional power over your 8-year-old sibling. You know what I mean? So how do you use that power and authority that you do have? You know, if you oversee a team, how do you talk to that team? If you're a parent, how do you discipline your kids? If you have siblings, how do you treat your younger siblings? I mean, for any of us, when you encounter the 16-year-old who's just trying to get through his shift at Chick-fil-A and they tell you, I'm sorry, we've run out of Chick-fil-A sauce. How do you talk to them? Or think about this when talking about power. Would people say that you're more or less a servant these days? Do you ever try to use people or intimidate people? How's your stubbornness quotient? Do you have a need to be in control? Do you have a problem receiving instruction gracefully? Just rate yourself 1, 2, or 3. If you haven't even gotten out a pen yet because you don't like to be told what to do, definitely give yourself a 3 on this one, all right? The last sort of negative character quality that Paul talks about here is the pursuit of dishonest gain or money mismanagement. You might want to write down the word integrity. Is your financial world on the up and up? You might want to get real concrete here. When thinking about the money entrusted to you, are you giving a greater share of your money away these days? Is that a desire of yours? Or is it a smaller share than you were a year ago, or about the same? Do you tithe to CCC? Do you give 10% of your income to CCC? And this is just baseline here that we're talking about. Rate yourself 1, 2, or 3. So take a little look at your list there. Just a little checklist to help me see, is my character growing in such a way that I'm likely to have the right kind of spiritual influence? And those are the negative qualities. And then in verse 8, Paul kind of gives really the flip side, the positive qualities that ought to replace them all. And then he says in verse 9, Paul says about elders, you must hold firmly to the trustworthy messages you've been taught so that you can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. Spiritual influence, gang, and elders especially, require a mind that is immersed in the Bible and a heart that is gripped by love for people. A mind immersed in the Bible and a heart that's gripped by love for other people, that encourages them and, if needed, rebukes them. It's not just knowing a lot of Bible verses, but it's using it to benefit people. One of the real significant contributions to immaturity in a whole lot of churches in our day, and in the failure of many people to live up to the full potential of influence, is simply biblical illiteracy. So again, reflecting on your own life, are you immersing yourself in the Bible these days? Are you intentional about it? Do you have a plan for that? And if nothing else, a place to start with this is this 52 challenge we've issued this year around here at CCC. It's not too late to be a part of that. You can start today if you haven't already. Or if you kind of slipped a little bit, you can just plug right back in. But at a bare minimum, the idea is 1 verse a week. We'll send you 1 verse a week, and you can saturate your mind with that verse and the meaning behind it and the truth it contains. Memorize it. Start turning it over in your mind. Because as the church, we gotta be immersed in the Bible. You will not reach your potential of spiritual influence without that. And then you gotta use a biblical mind to build up other people. Are you doing that? Again, 1, 2, or 3. Rate yourself. Because that's when your fingerprints really start getting in others' lives. You know, there's a book called Becoming a Person of Influence, and it's by a teacher whose name was Helen Roswell, and she had a student named Mark Eklund back when he was in junior high school. And she writes about how it's not easy to be a junior high teacher. I remember hearing Tony Campolo say junior high is where people go to pay for their sins. And it's tough to work with middle schoolers, junior hires. There's a lot of burnout there. It's a real challenge. But Helen loved it. And she loved working with them. And this is what she wrote. One Friday, things didn't feel right. We worked hard on a new concept, but the students were frustrated with themselves and edgy with one another. I had to stop this crankiness before it got out of hand, so I asked them to list the names of other students in the room on 2 sheets of paper, leaving space between each name. And then I told them to think of the nicest things they could say about each of their classmates and write it down. It took the remainder of the class period to finish the assignment, but as the students left the room, each one handed me their paper. That Saturday, I wrote down the name of every student on a separate sheet of paper, and I listed what everyone else said about that individual. On Monday, I gave each student his or her list. Some of them ran 2 pages long. Before long, the entire class was smiling. "Really?" I heard whispered. I never knew that meant anything to anyone. I didn't know others liked me so much. No one ever mentioned these papers in class again. I never knew if they were discussed after class or with their parents. It didn't matter. The exercise had accomplished its purpose. The students were happy with themselves, and they were happy with one another. Many years later, she writes, I was visiting my parents, and my dad said to me, "The Eklunds called last night." "Really?" I said. "I haven't heard from them for several years. I wonder how Mark is." Dad responded quietly. "Mark was killed in the war serving overseas. And the funeral's tomorrow, and his parents would like it if you could attend." Helen writes, "As I stood there by the coffin the next day, one of the soldiers who had acted as a pallbearer came up to me. 'Were you Mark's math teacher?' he asked. I nodded as I continued to stare at the coffin. "Mark talked about you a lot," he said. After the funeral, most of Mark's former classmates gathered for lunch. Mark's mom and dad were there, obviously waiting for me. "I want to show you something," his father said, taking a wallet out of his pocket. "They found this on Mark when he was killed. We thought you might recognize it." Opening the billfold, he carefully removed 2 worn pieces of notebook paper that had obviously been taped and folded and refolded many times. I knew without looking that the papers were the ones on which I had listed all the good things each of Mark's classmates had said to him. "Thank you so much for doing that," Mark's mother said. As you can see, Mark treasured it. Mark's classmates started to gather around us. Chuck smiled rather sheepishly and said, "I still have my list. It's in the top drawer of my desk at home." John's wife said, "John asked me to put his in our wedding album." "I have mine too," Marilyn said. "It's in my diary." Then Vicky, another classmate, reached into her pocketbook, took out her wallet, and showed her worn and frazzled list to the group. "I carry this with me at all times," Vicky said, without batting an eyelash. "I think we all saved our lists." That's when I finally sat down and cried, Helen writes. What would make so many adults hold on to a piece of paper that they had received so many years before as a kid, carrying it with them everywhere they went, even into battle, halfway around the world? "Well, I believe," she said, "it's because the soul lives on words of love. It's like the body lives on food and water, and the soul lives on words of love." You know, one day around 2,000 years ago, a pretty lonely guy on the island of Crete, he got a piece of paper. He picked it up and he started reading it, and he saw what Paul wrote to Titus. "My true son, my son." I have a feeling Titus, if he could have, would carry that piece of paper with him for a long time. Do you know what? You can do that. You can do that in your little circle, whatever your circle is. You can do it right now. Before this day is up, there might be somebody who needs to hear some words like that from you. There's somebody that needs to have somebody put a hand on their shoulder, somebody that needs to be embraced. There's somebody that needs to be prayed for, somebody that needs to get a note. Maybe there's somebody who feels really lonely and just needs to hear that they're loved by God and by another human being. And you can do that. Who do you need to become, CCC? And who do you need to influence? And who do you need to thank for influencing you in the best possible way?
We're going to take a few moments and celebrate communion. Go ahead and grab some bread and juice, and feel free to take them in your own time. Communion helps us remember Jesus' sacrifice for us. We eat the bread as a reminder that he gave himself up for us, and we drink the juice as a way of remembering his blood was spilled for each and every one of us. Now is a great time to reflect on how much God loves you, how much he accepts you and wants to be connected with you. So much that Jesus was willing to die so we could each be forgiven. Let's spend some time remembering Jesus.
I will sing of your goodness, I will sing of your love. Though the seasons come quickly, you have always been enough. Though the night may get darker, though the waiting seems long, you have always been faithful to remind me of your love. You are good. In the morning I sing, you are good. In the evening I sing, you are good. You're good to me. You have always been patient. You have always been kind. You're consistent through the ages. Oh, what a friend of mine. So I remind my soul to bless you, standing firm upon your truth. No, you cannot be shaken, 'cause I see what you can do. Oh, you are good. In the morning I sing, you are good. In the evening I sing, you are good. You are good to me. You keep on getting better. 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 I know you keep on getting better. You keep on getting better. I know you keep on getting better. 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 You are good. In the morning I sing, you are good. In the evening I sing, you are good. You are good to me. Oh, you are good. In the morning I sing, you are good. In the evening I sing, you are good. You are good to me.
If my heart is overwhelmed and I cannot hear your voice, I hold on to what is true, though I cannot see. If the storms of life they come and the road ahead gets steep, I will lift these hands in faith. I will believe. I remind myself of all that you've done and the life I have because of your Son. Love came down and rescued me. Love came down and set me free. And I am yours. I am forever yours. Mountain high or valley low, I sing out, remind my soul that I am yours. I am forever yours. When my heart is filled with hope, every promise comes my way. When I feel your hands of grace rest upon me, staying desperate for you, God, staying humble at your feet, I will lift these hands Jesus, I am yours. I am yours. I am yours. All my days, Jesus, I am yours. Love came down and rescued me. Love came down and set me free. And I am yours. I am forever yours. Mountain high or valley low, I sing out, remind my soul that I am yours. I am forever yours.
Thanks again for tuning in and making CCC a part of your weekend. I really hope this online service is the highlight of your week. Community Christian Church is all about helping people find their way back to God, no matter where you are on your faith journey. And if you'd like to support those efforts and contribute financially, you can click the Give tab at communitycc.net or text CCC White Marsh to 77977. Your giving makes all the ministry efforts of this church possible, so thank you for your continued generosity. Make sure and mark your calendar for the June 6th outdoor baptism celebration. It's happening around the in-person services that morning, and there will be a big tent set up on the back parking lot with music and long games and some food trucks. And we're gonna celebrate as people go public with their faith in Jesus and get baptized. Maybe you've come to a place in your life where you're ready to step into a relationship with Jesus. Well, June 6th is your day. Check out the events page at communitycc.net to get your baptism scheduled or ask any questions you might have. We'd love to help figure out if this is the next step for you. Don't forget to say hi on social media and connect all week. We'll see you right back here next time. Bye, everybody.